Try turning the microphone on, that'd be better. Good evening. I will now reconvene the 25th of November 2020 full council meeting. I'd like to remind everyone present that this meeting is being live streamed to the council's online webcast channel. That members use the raise your hand option when you wish to speak. You will be given permission to unmute from Democratic Services. Councillors Haig and Worrell have sent their apologies for this meeting. Are there any other apologies? No. Okay, we will then reconvene from item 6 of the 25th of November's council meeting. We now go to questions from members of the public. One question has been submitted and accepted by the monitoring officer. This is set out on page 37 of the agenda. For the benefit of the recording of this meeting, I would ask that the questioner read out their question when asked to do so. Can I remind the questioner and member to be as brief as possible in their questions? I would also inform the questioner that any supplementary question they ask should not take the form of a statement and must be related to the original question or the answer that is given. Question 1. Mr. Perrin, would you please read out your question to Councillor Johnson as set out on page 37 of the agenda?
Hello. Hello.
Good evening, Mr. Perrin. We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Mr. Perrin, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Over a number of years, the council has been carrying out a programme of installing double glazed windows in council rented housing. Can you assure residents that these windows meet with current health and safety regulations, particularly with regard to escape rescue in the event of fire?
Thank you. Councillor Johnson, could you please respond to the question?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Perrin, and good evening. Long time no speak. Thank you for the question. The council have always installed windows that would comply with the applicable regulations at the time of installation, either via an approved contractor scheme known as Fencer or through building regulations applications. Therefore, I can confirm, Mr. Perrin, that I am confident that windows and doors installed in council housing stock do meet building regulations as appropriate, including, where applicable, fire egress hinges for means of escape.
Mr. Perrin, do you wish to pose a supplementary question?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, thank you. I asked my question having in mind the shocking revelations of flagrant disregard of health and safety regulations with regard to Grimhill Towers. These windows have a maximum opening of 12¼ inches, 310 millimetres. I have tried to exit my council rented property by way of the window and found it impossible to do so. Are you able to give an assurance that in the event of an emergency, for example a fire, and the window was the only means of escape, the fire service will be able to speedily rescue people, especially those living in high-rise buildings? Would you consider a further report by the fire services on the suitability of these windows?
Thank you, Mr. Perrin. Councillor Johnson, could you answer the question?
Thank you, Mr. Perrin. With regards to the high-rise buildings, I believe that the windows with the correct egress statement in them, hinges are correct and are installed in them. I'm perfectly happy with that. I wish you hadn't have tried to get out of your building by the window. It's not very, quite dangerous, Mr. Perrin, but I'm happy that the fire service would be able to release you from a building of your size if that was the only escape route in the event of fire. But I'm willing to look again at any report that you think may make residents of Thurrock feel even safer. But at this present moment in time, I'm quite happy that those windows are correct. I mean, it's not always possible to install a new window into an old house to meet all current regulations in regards to fire escape, because you'll have things like the window sill height or the actual size of the opening may not meet the latest regulation requirements. But in these instances, you know, as long as they are not impeding the opening size anymore, that, you know, we would accept them under the regulations. But I will ask someone to look at that again if you're saying that it's impossible to get out of your property through the window.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson, and thank you for your question, Mr. Perrin. Moving on to item 7, petitions from members of the public and councillors. Please be advised that in accordance with the council's petition scheme, no notices of petitions were received. We now go on to item 8, update report in respect to petitions presented at full council and council officers. This report can be found on page 39 of the agenda and is information on the status of petitions handed in at council meetings and council offices. Item 9, appointments to committees and outside bodies, statutory and other panels. Councillor Gledhill, do you wish to make any changes to the appointments previously made?
None, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Kent, do you wish to make any changes to appointments previously made?
No, thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Councillor Byrne, do you wish to make any changes to the appointments previously made?
No, thank you, Mayor.
Councillor Massey, do you wish to make any changes to the appointments previously made?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. And Councillor Owen, do you wish to make any changes to the appointments previously made?
No changes, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Moving on to item 11, to receive reports from Cabinet members. There is one Cabinet member report on the agenda this evening, report of Councillor Johnson, the Cabinet member for Housing. Can be found on pages 47 to 58 of the agenda. The time allowed is 20 minutes. I will take one question from each member and we'll come back to those members who may wish to ask any additional questions if time allows. Please can I remind members to be as brief as possible in their questions and answers to ensure that we cover as many questions as submitted. Councillor Johnson, would you please introduce your report? You have 5 minutes allocated for this.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Tonight I'll be delivering my third Cabinet member report for housing, but it would be remiss of me not to begin by thanking all the officers, council partners and volunteers who have come together to do such a marvellous job in continuing to provide the housing service in such difficult times. You really are all hero key workers. If I may, I'll begin with performance. In 2019-20, the housing service recorded its strongest performance for overall satisfaction with housing services since we began measuring tenant satisfaction in 13-14, with the department finishing a very difficult year very strongly, reaching 79.5%, an increase of 7% compared to March 2019. Satisfaction with transforming homes remained higher for 19-20, with repairs satisfaction levels demonstrating a consistent level, and the 3 tenant satisfaction measure, which were only added to the performance scorecard in 2018-19, saw continued improvement. Complaints for the housing service also continued to see a year-on-year reduction in the number received from a high of 894 in 2016-17, reducing to 547 for 2019-20. And with the department undertaking a full tenant and leaseholder satisfaction survey, I'm confident this trend will continue. The results of this survey are currently being analysed and will be shared with Housing ONS in due course. However, as long as no complaint is taken lightly and we use them to learn, we will definitely continue to improve in this area. The COVID-19 pandemic, although making the delivery of the housing service tougher, I'm very pleased that the Housing Department worked tirelessly to support and protect the health and well-being of both those who access the service and staff alike. Contact right across the service has increased, with tenancy officers contacting vulnerable tenants during lockdown periods, and the sheltered housing officers also significantly increasing their daily and weekly calls to residents, having made in excess of 60,000 extra contact calls since March 2020. Following government guidance in March 26, 2020 to bring everyone in, the council worked to identify and provide accommodation to all known rough sleepers, and by the end of October 2020 had accommodated 56 individuals who were either rough sleeping or at risk of rough sleeping. And by the end of October 2020 had accommodated 56 individuals by the end of October 2020 who were either rough sleeping or risk of rough sleeping, with support service and voluntary organisations working alongside the council to provide food supplies for those in bed and breakfast. I'm particularly pleased with this area of work and can confirm the team have undertaken mental health care and housing and support assessments for each of those who were accommodated, and are working very hard to ensure that no one accommodated returns to rough sleeping. Whilst there was a reduction in the number of approaches to the homelessness team, this can be attributed in the main to the national eviction ban. However, the flip side of this ban has also reduced the availability of vacant properties within the private rental sector in Thurrock. Like all local authorities, Thurrock was required to reduce council rents by 1% each year from April 2016 until March 2020, with the resulting impact of a reduction in spending power for repair, maintenance and improvements of circa £18.7 million. However, following a period of tenant engagement last year, when rents were increased by CPI plus 1%, and taking that tenant feedback on board, funding was successfully identified and allocated to priority areas. Under housing development, a number of new council-owned homes have been and will be handed over in this current financial year. More specifically, 29 flats at the award-winning site known as Elmer Court in Grays, with a further 53 homes at Claudian Way in Chapel St Mary, which should be completed early this year. Work is also ongoing to build 35 homes specifically for older people at Calcutta Road in Tilbury, with handover due in summer 2021. Cabinet agreed in March 2019 to a housing development pipeline to seek to deliver 500 new council homes over the next 5 to 10 years to be funded by the Housing Revenue Account. The process to identify potential sites was agreed by Cabinet in 2020, and in line with that process, update reports are regularly presented to Housing O&S Committee. Using this process, public consultation on design proposals at the Culver Centre and Field site for 173 dwellings for a mixed tenure to include a minimum of 35% of affordable housing was very recently presented to the Planning Committee. Mr Mayor, that would conclude my report tonight. I'm trying to keep it as short as I can, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. As Councillor Worrell, the shadow portfolio holder for housing, has sent her apologies this evening, I will go straight to Councillor Spillman as Chair of the Housing Overview and Scrutiny Committee. Councillor Spillman, do you wish to speak?
Yes, Mr Mayor. Can you hear me okay in the chamber?
Yes.
Brilliant. I mean, I've been on Housing O&S, obviously chairing that for the last couple of meetings, and I think I can say on behalf of members from whatever party that we've got a lot of time for all the efforts that Housing have put in during this terrible time. They've done an amazing job, and everything's been thrown up in the air, and they've kept the show on the road. So a lot of thanks to all the staff in that department. Regarding, I mean, we've gone through all the problems and all the difficulties that Housing have been facing, portfolio holder, but are there any new ways of working that have come out of this that you actually think you can carry on and carry forward when life returns to normal? Have you learned any, different areas where necessity has provided, a need to make changes, and you might carry them forward?
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Councillor Spillman. I think that the biggest lesson we've learned is through the homelessness team, whereby when everybody was called in, I was under the impression for many a year that we had between 9 and 10 rough sleepers, but we ended up homing 53 homeless people, or potentially homeless people. So certainly a lesson learned there that this problem is certainly larger than we thought. But in saying that, we managed to get them all accommodated. We managed to also ensure that whilst they were in accommodation, they had constant meetings, feedback with officers discussing their mental health provisions and obviously food and provision. But it's come to a point where if we continue the way we are, we hopefully should be able to ensure that nobody actually goes back to going on the street as rough sleepers. We're working really hard with them to ensure that doesn't happen. Now, obviously, not everybody actually wants to work with the council, but so far, the lessons we've learned and how we've gone through it are making something come to fruition that we will hopefully get what the Conservative government wanted, and that is have no more rough sleepers on the streets of Thurrock.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Councillor John Kent, do you wish to speak?
Mr. Mayor, one of the lessons I think we've learned over the last year during the pandemic is the crucial importance of our parks and open spaces. So it's really disappointing to see that the portfolio holder still has the Elm Road open space in Grays earmarked for development. I've got here over 60 letters from local residents objecting to building on Elm Road open space, which I will forward to the portfolio holder after this meeting. But can I just ask him, please, once and for all, to remove the Elm Road open space from his list of sites for potential development?
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Councillor. Getting feedback. As I think I've said before, this is a consultation process, and once that consultation is in, those 60 letters are obviously going to help. It'd be helpful if they're here sooner rather than later, and a decision can be made as and when that comes through. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm definitely going to remove that from the housing list, because that's not how a consultation works. We have to hear what people have to say.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Councillor Byrne, do you wish to speak?
Yes, echo what Councillor Spillman said. It's been a tough year, and it's been a great effort for everyone concerned. But along with what JK said, open space. We haven't had a great year with building on open space, and we seem to be forever wanting to build on Greenbelt at the moment. So I think we really need to look at our open spaces and keep them as open spaces.
Thank you, Councillor Byrne. Councillor Massey, do you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Allen, would you like to speak?
Yes, please, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Johnson, I myself have put through many complaints via members' inquiries on behalf of tenants in regards to damp and mould, especially in our high-rise blocks in Tilbury, Chadwell St Mary, Blackshots and Grays. Please can I ask what you as portfolio holder are proposing to do to ensure acceptable living and safety standards in all of these properties?
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you very much, Councillor Allen. At I was going to say the last cabinet meeting, it wasn't the last one because I've only just come off that, and the meeting before that, I actually announced that I have commissioned officers to look at a full proper picture, no stone left unturned for our high rises to see where the problem actually lies, because over a period of time, considerable amounts of money have been spent on getting ventilation machinery or working in these buildings. What is for sure is, damp and mold is not acceptable anywhere. But what we're not sure is why that keeps happening. If that is the way the building's constructed, or whether that's, how can we say, people's choice of lifestyles to use these ventilation machines. But I can assure you we are doing everything we can to find a solution. As I said, with the paper that I introduced in November, I think that will go some way to helping us find a solution. We're concentrating mainly on the blocks in Blackshots at the moment, and I think hopefully that will give us a much better picture overall, where we can then start getting it right all the way through. But as I said, I do have to. What I'm not clear in my head, and I don't in a lot of the officers' minds, is as well whether that problem is from the buildings or whether the way the residents are using the equipment that they have in their behest, or whether they're not using it, as the case may be. But it is something we will look at.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Now move on to questions from other members. Councillor Rice, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Johnson, the residents of Heathland Close, the bungalows, they're very pleased with their accommodation. They only have one moan, of which I have got on to the various officers, but perhaps you can just make a special mention. It's the collection of their refuge bins. From time to time they get missed, and they end up having to wait a week or more for them to be collected. So I'm sure you could put a word in and make sure those things happen. And that would be really appreciated by the tenants.
Councillor Johnson?
Yes, of course I'll put that word in. I hope my voice carries that much authority, Councillor Rice, but obviously nobody wants to have their refuse bins missed. We do, though there has been particular problems with COVID in general about collecting their refuse bins, but maybe this is something to do with the fact that they're new properties. I don't know, but yes, I will certainly look into it for you, and I will follow up on any of your members' inquiries.
Thank you. Councillor Muldowney, would you like to pose your question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Johnson, I'd just like to ask, obviously it's very good to hear the advances that have been made with tackling rough sleeping in the area, and getting a real idea about the size of the problem. Obviously we're back in lockdown now, and the weather is much, much worse than in previous lockdowns. But we've seen in recent weeks that the government's not renewing its commitment to rehoming our rough sleepers and our homeless. Can you confirm that we will continue to work to rehome all the rough sleepers in Thurrock, please?
Most certainly. Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
That's all right. Go ahead.
Yes, most certainly, Councillor Muldowney. Thank you for the question, and perhaps I can give you some figures actually to where we have actually made a breakthrough, if you like. So with the team ensuring that no one accommodated returns to rough sleeping and aiming to provide that long-term settled accommodation for positive transition to independent living, that is something we will continue to do. But so far, we've had 15 households have moved on from the temporary accommodation, which have been provided by the council, 14 of which found and secured accommodation in the private rental sector within the council's assistance, with the council's assistance. 9 households have moved on from the temporary accommodation of their own accord, and unfortunately 5 returned to prison. But yes, I do take on board what you're saying, and my officers will endeavour to ensure that we keep as many rough sleepers off of the streets of Thurrock that we possibly can.
Thank you. Councillor Fletcher, would you like to pose your question, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you for your report, Councillor Johnson. On the question of mould as a problem, as quite a widespread problem, I would just ask you not to limit it to the high rises. There are a number of areas in South Ockenden, particularly the Flowers Estate, where mould is becoming really quite a widespread, dare I say, epidemic problem. Given the construction of the Flowers Estate, I would suggest that it has quite a lot to do with the buildings. But whatever the cause, we do need, if you have a team that's starting to look at the issue, I would ask you to get some of your people to talk to council tenants in Ockenden. You will find it's quite common, quite widespread there.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. I have spoken to lots of council tenants in South Ockenden in my time with this council. I have to advise you, and I do agree the Flowers Estate has quite often been a problem. But I must admit, in recent year times, looking at the complaints I've had, it hasn't appeared such a big problem over there. But I do agree we can't limit it to just the high rises. However, hopefully you will agree with me that we do have to start somewhere, and the high rises is probably the best place to start, as that's where certainly I've seen most of the complaints coming in so far.
Thank you. We now come to time for Councillor Johnson. Could you please sum up, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To sum up, well, the council continues to provide many key housing services for tenants and residents across the borough, where performances in several areas remain strong, with good progress made in others. As explained earlier, whilst the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on the delivery of the service since March 2020, officers, partners and volunteers have worked tirelessly to minimise and mitigate wherever possible in order for that service to continue to be provided to those who were and are in need. And I can promise that work will continue to identify areas for improvement in order to not only deliver value for money for Thurrock residents, but a greater customer experience, leading to overall levels of satisfaction for those using our services. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. We now move on to item 12, which is questions from members. We have, excuse me, up to 30 minutes for this item. The question to the leader has been withdrawn. There are now 5 questions to Cabinet members, as Councillor Kearing has withdrawn his question to Councillor Coxwell. These can be found on page 57 of the agenda. Those questions not dealt with at this meeting, the member to whom the question is addressed shall provide a written answer as soon as possible after the meeting. For the benefit of the recording of this meeting, I would ask those members who have submitted questions to please read out the question when asked to do so. And we've got to move on to question 1, which is from Councillor John Kent. Could you please read out your question?
In the last year, how many homeless Thurrock households have been rehoused outside of the borough?
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for your question, Councillor Kent. During the previous calendar year, of the 345 households who were placed into emergency temporary accommodation, approximately 56% were placed in Thurrock and approximately 44% placed outside of Thurrock. But just to put some context to these percentages, of the placements outside of Thurrock, over 90% were placed in neighbouring authorities of Basildon, Havering or Southend.
Thank you. Councillor John Kent, do you wish to pose a supplementary question?
Mr. Mayor, Freedom of Information Request 10289 tells us that is in fact 188 Thurrock households that have been rehoused outside of the borough. And of those 188 households, 145 of those were households with children. You know, that's kids that have been taken away from their schools, taken away from their support groups, taken away from extended family. Mr. Mayor, this is reaching a crisis point. So can I ask the portfolio holder what firm plans he has to make sure that no more Thurrock families are rehoused outside of the borough?
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Councillor. Is it feedback on yet? No, I can still hear myself speaking. The calendar year I was referring to was the 1st of January 2020 to the 31st of March 2020. According to my figures, it's actually 218 that were placed outside of the Thurrock area. I haven't got the figures to hand of how many of those included children, and I must state here and now that I really don't want anybody placed outside of Thurrock, certainly those with children. We have made strides towards getting this better. We recently brought Brook House back into working order, which I think gives us 10 units. With the recent proposal for Alexander Court, where that will eventually give us something like 40 units of emergency temporary accommodation. So although that doesn't count for the amount of people that we have got outside of the borough, it certainly goes a long way to help. But I think we have to take the word emergency into real context here, Councillor Kent. You know, that it is emergency to temporary accommodation. So whilst we try everything to get people accommodated within Thurrock, the word emergency then takes over, because if that isn't possible, they need to be housed. So we will look to house them wherever we can. But I assure you, we are working as hard as possible to try and increase those numbers of emergency temporary accommodation we have within Thurrock.
Thank you. Councillor John Kent, do you wish to pose a second supplementary question?
Mr. Mayor, I'm grateful for the clarification from the portfolio holder that he believes that the majority of these households that have been placed outside of the borough were placed there as an emergency, so therefore only short term. Can you tell me how many of these were actually emergency short term, and how many of these Thurrock families have ended up living outside the borough permanently?
Councillor Johnson.
The honest answer to that is I don't have those actual figures in front of me, but I reiterate that it is emergency temporary accommodation. And if emergency temporary accommodation lasts longer than 1 day, 2 days, 3 weeks, 4 months, then the accommodating of that resident is far more important than where it is, in my opinion. As I can't reiterate enough to say we are doing everything we can to, and we will always look to try and accommodate people for an emergency temporary accommodation within Thurrock. But I can't get away from that word emergency. And you say, if you put into temporary accommodation because of an emergency, that means we can't just move you back willy-nilly. So if it does go on longer than, as I said, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I'm afraid that is something that just has to happen. We will look at the people's safety and security above where they actually are.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. We now move on to question 2 from Councillor Byrne. Councillor Byrne, would you please read out your question as set out on page 57 of the agenda?
Well, I want to ask for a bit of licence on this, because since my question went in, things have changed. So since putting in the question, I know the deed of variation on the 106 agreement has been completed after 3 years of training, of trying. So my question is still, why did we miss the deadline to claim 600,000 still stands? But now the bigger question is, why are TBC not seeking any funding from the TEP or the Thames Enterprise Park when we are seeking a voluntary contribution from the London Gateway, yet we are not taking up the obligatory one from TEP? The London Gateway contribution for the bus interchange to the north side of the London Road and not the station improvements. So why are we asking for a voluntary contribution and not for a guaranteed one?
Right. Councillor Coxall.
I'm happy to go into the explanation that in not here today about the negotiations between them all. But look, it's important from the LDO passed by this council and right the way back from there, London Gateway have an obligation under Section 106 to requirement to design and construction of the bus turnaround. Since this has happened, we have then decided to do improvements to the trains to the station and improvements connected to the bus turnaround. And as you were aware, we've had to review these and have had significant enhancements to proposals to the bus turnaround and to the station to give a much better residents parking, a much better experience, and a better station. The council has been bringing forward these and still bringing forward the contributions. We're in dialogue with London Gateway and DP World for the revised turnabout and securing in the future. And we expect DP World to stick to their commitments made in the 106 and the LDOs agreed by this council, and in sort of the spirit of the law and in spirit as well. Now, as for the Thames Enterprise Park, as that moves forward into a plan application, we will then leave that until as a plan application comes forward for Thames Enterprise Park and see what happens at that point. As we said, the 106 commitments and the planning department will deliver the commitments around what happens there. And if there is a 106 and a transport commitment coming out of Thames Enterprise Parks as it goes through planning, that will come forward at that due course.
Councillor Byrne, do you have propose a supplementary question?
Oh, yes, please. The small parcel land purchased opposite for £3 million against a much larger plot at the Stamford car park was sold at 280,000. Does this 3 million represent good value, or as it's owned by a UKIP supporter, were you done up like a kipper by a kipper, or was the car park grossly knowingly undersold?
Councillor Coxon.
I would say it was grossly undersold at that sort of money. I think in the end, after the Conservatives councillors in Stamford objected severe, there was an extra £100,000. I think it went for 350 in the end. It was vastly underpriced for 21 units there and a shop, and the loss of parking around in Stamford. That should be a shame on the opposition who did deliver that through there, and that's why we brought in 2016 the 3 Rs to review and make sure we release fairly into the open market, and you'll be seeing that coming forward very shortly in a paper to cabinet. So this doesn't happen. As I've always said, what we need in sale of land and assets of the council is we should have sunlight is the best disinfectant for policy changes, and we will shine sunlight in all the land of what we're selling and what we'd like to do with it, and that hopefully will never happen again. As for the £3 million, I like your joke about the UKIP. Whoever owns the land and wherever their political allegiances lie, it was ideal for us. It made the better opportunities to deliver a fantastic parking facilities and fantastic new train station and turnaround. So I think the £3 million there, instead of building into the river and the extra works that the residents didn't want on that side there, this is an opportunity. It's a shame it wasn't done 4 years earlier, but at that point we weren't in administration.
Thank you. Councillor Byrne, do you have a second and final supplementary question?
Yes, please. When Councillor Ralph was with the TI, he had a story ready for the press, naming and shaming the very people responsible for letting Stamford down on this station project. In the interest of learning from our mistakes, as you stated last month over the A13, with ample time to give and to pause and review and come out of it in a better place, will you allow Councillor Ralph to publish that story? Only then can we hold the correct people accountable for the abysmal project management of this station project and the long-term suffering caused to commuters.
I think you're confused.
Yeah, Councillor
I think you're confusing two things there. I'm maybe a bit confused. Are you talking about the parking of in the town centre, which was not in this administration, and that the people there, some of the councillors are not longer elected councillors, and some are no longer members who are actually involved in that. So, and I have obviously, as a previous administration, wouldn't be privy to conversations of a previous cabinet and why that went forward. As for this long process of maybe 15 years in the process to deliver this. There's a lot of people involved in this. I think the designs that were taken over to try and you've got to work in when there's a pause and reflect, which has come in on the learning of the A13. I think sometimes you have to in public build you have to stop, relook at what it is instead of carry on building the wrong thing that residents want. Residents weren't very happy with the position what the council what we're proposing there. There was a pause, a reflect, and once you reflect, you do make changes. And I think we've got a better scheme coming out of that. As for naming and shaming people, I think, as I said, you've got to go back and do. What would you let's sunlight is the best disinfectant. If we've made mistakes in that, you can't learn without getting that. And I'm very happy for anyone and that. And just like any projects in my department, I think that improves the position, improves the area, and improves what the residents actually want. Blindly carrying on, going down alleys isn't the right way. And I think what's been proved by pause and reflect out of the learnings of the A13 is a great scheme that the people of Stamford and Corringham will be very proud of once we get through planning.
Thank you, Councillor Cottrell. Moving on to question 3 from Councillor Muldowney. Please read out your question as set out on page 57 of the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can the portfolio holder tell us when this administration will finally sign off on building some new, genuinely affordable housing for Thurrock residents?
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you, Councillor, for your question. Can I begin by reminding the Chamber that we do have a housing development programme in place, which is regularly shared with Housing Overview and Scrutiny, in which we continually look for further delivery opportunities. And in this regard, the Housing ONS Committee recently considered a report that was presented by myself and Councillor Coxall, pointing out the further mixed approach the Council will take to increase provision for new homes for our residents with good community engagement. But in direct response to your question, I'm very pleased to report significant progress in delivering affordable homes for Thurrock residents, with 29 units handed over in June 2020 at the award-winning Alma Court site in Grays, which has generated a high level of satisfaction with regards to its quality of design. We are currently in the process of taking handover our 53-unit site in Claudian Way, Chelsea St Mary, which completes very, very soon. It is part complete at the moment. There's also a 35-unit scheme for older persons housing at Calcutta Road in, in Tilbury, which we hope to conclude by late summer 2021. All of these schemes will deliver 100% affordable homes, and I can also report that earlier this evening at Cabinet I presented a report seeking approval to tender a construction contract at Lowen Road, Chelsea St Mary, to build a further 5 3-bedroom family homes to be rented via the Housing Revenue account. There's also the scheme at the Culver Centre, which, as I mentioned in my report, is getting very close to coming to fruition, with 173 properties where 35% of those will be affordable homes.
Councillor Muldowney, do you wish to propose a supplementary question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, portfolio holder, for your answer. What your answer didn't mention was the first 3 schemes that you claim as your own were actually signed off under the previous administration. So to date, my count is that just tonight, just before this meeting, you've managed to sign off 5 houses to be built in Lowen Road, a really appalling record after 4 years in power. But I'm going to move on. Can the administration let us know when are they going to actually put spades in the ground to deliver the council houses that they've been promising for, well, must be nearly 2 years now since I've been a councillor. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Councillor Muldowney. I started off my first answer with you making a point by reminding the Chamber of the housing development programme that's in place. Once all parties engage in this and don't keep throwing things in its way, then hopefully we can get a lot more of these sites ready, up and running. There are plenty of affordable homes going to planning this year, but I'm not going to go any further than that as to say they are there, they will be done. Thank you very much for your compliment about 4 years and only getting 5 houses done.
Councillor Muldowney, do you wish to pose a second supplementary question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. It wasn't really a compliment. It's appalling that you've only managed to now bring forward 5 houses after 4 years in power. But let me go back to my original question on affordability. Will local residents be able to afford any of these new council houses if they're ever built? I note that in your report on page 51 tonight, you say that rents and service charges are being set subject to a local housing allowance cap. However, in a recent housing scrutiny report, it stated only that the council will try to ensure that it does not set the level of rent and service charges above the local housing allowance level. Will Councillor Johnson give a cast iron guarantee that when these houses do come online, whenever that may be, housing rents and service charges will not exceed the benefits limit?
Councillor Johnson.
I think you answered the question yourself, Councillor Muldowney. You know, that every effort will be made to make sure that that happens.
Thank you. Moving on to question 4, which is also from Councillor Muldowney. Could you please read out your question to Councillor Mays?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can the portfolio holder tell the Chamber how many GP surgeries he's visited since taking up his portfolio in January, and that's January 2020?
Councillor Mays, would you please respond?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Councillor, for your question. Since taking office, unfortunately, I haven't been able to physically visit any GP surgery, obviously due to the coronavirus pandemic. However, I have been meeting with partners in the health just to make sure that we are working together for the best outcome for Thurrock throughout this pandemic.
Councillor Muldowney, do you wish to pose a supplementary question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Of course, you all know from your conversations with our health partners that even before COVID, there have been widespread problems with people being unable to see their GP. With the pressures brought by COVID, can you tell us what conversations or meetings you've been having to ensure that Thurrock residents can see their GP when they need to?
Councillor Mays.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for your supplementary question, Councillor. I met with the CCG, head of Thurrock CCG, as with myself, as well as Councillor Holden and other partners, to discuss how whether it's physical or virtual GP's appointments are being handed out. I was pleasantly surprised that actually there was a large amount of face-to-face appointments. However, that doesn't get away from the fact that people do find it difficult to see their GPs. And obviously that was spoken about. I know they are trying to work very hard to see people in a COVID world and COVID secure as much as possible. Obviously they have had to change the same as everybody else to meet the demands of what we're facing, and they have our full support in doing so.
Councillor Muldowney, do you wish to pose a second supplementary question?
Yes, please, Mr. Mayor. Given the issues which obviously you acknowledged that people are having with seeing their GPs for everyday ailments, and also the recent issues with the rollout of the winter flu vaccination, are you 100% confident that the rollout of the COVID vaccination, which is so important for us getting out from underneath the cosh of this deadly virus, that this rollout in Thurrock will proceed smoothly?
Councillor Mays.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for your supplementary. I have faith in our health professional and our colleagues within and partners within the healthcare. They are working around the clock, extremely hard, with extremely difficult circumstances, whether it's trying to deal with general healthcare issues, as well as the vaccination, as well as the flu vaccination. So in discussing it with them, they are actively rolling out vaccinations, as I was very, very happy to hear a 107-year-old resident of Alsip got vaccinated in Stifford Clays last week, and lots of different people being vaccinated so that we can get out of this pandemic as quick as possible. So I believe we will get through this. I believe there's a lot more work that the GPs are doing to build up the ability to vaccinate. It is a logistical beast, as I'm sure everybody can imagine, but they are working round the clock to ensure that people get vaccinated so we can get out of COVID as quick as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mays. Moving on to question 6 from Councillor John Kent. Councillor John Kent, please read out your question as set out on page 57 of the agenda.
When does the portfolio holder anticipate the electricity supply issues affecting some residents of Erin Court will finally be resolved?
Councillor Johnson, would you wish to respond?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for your question, Councillor Kent. The loss of electricity to any home is obviously very upsetting, but we can confirm that the issue with the power supply to the selected properties in Erin was fully restored last year. We do understand, however, though, how disruptive this is, especially in the case of our sheltered housing schemes, and therefore it is key that we work as quickly as possible to remedy any faults when they occur. Council officers will continue to work constructively with third-party organisations to improve communication and service delivery in the future to ensure critical infrastructure such as this for the supply of services to homes in the borough is repaired and maintained when issues do arise.
Councillor Kent, John Kent, do you wish to pose a supplementary question?
Yeah, this question I initially put to October's meeting, so clearly the issue has now been resolved, but it did flag up some other issues. So there were a couple of elderly, vulnerable residents that were left without any electricity for a couple of days. In that time, they had no way of heating, no way of cooking, no way even of boiling a kettle. There was no lighting provided for them. These people are living in a sheltered accommodation because they need some extra support which unfortunately they didn't get. I'm glad the issue has now been resolved, but can I ask the portfolio holder if he will instigate a review or ask the scrutiny committee to instigate a review that can help us to make sure that when things do go wrong in our sheltered complexes, the system kicks in and makes sure that people are properly looked after, because I really don't think it happened on this occasion.
Councillor Johnson.
Oops. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks for your supplementary, Councillor Kane. As I tried to say in my response in there, well, you've called it a review, but this look at is already taking place by officers. They are ensuring that this, I can't say this is never going to happen again because loss of service can happen, but they are working already to ensure that there is a process in place that means that vulnerable people will not be left, well, certainly not for 2 days without any heating or lighting.
Councillor John Kent, do you wish to pose a second supplementary question?
Now, I'm grateful for that response. It is helpful. Apologies if I didn't quite understand the first response I got. I understood that to be a look at the way the council dealt with other agencies, such as power supply and this power supply company and our contractors. If I misunderstood that, I apologise, but I'm glad that there is, as the portfolio holder called it, a look into this.
Thank you. Moving on now to item 13, reports from members representing the council on outside bodies. Does any member who represents the council on outside bodies wish to present a report? No? Okay, moving on to item 14, minutes of committees. These are listed on the agenda contents page. Moving on to item 15, motions update report. The next item can be found on page 59 to 62 of the agenda and is an update on the ongoing motions to council. We now move on to item 16, which is motion 1. Councillor John Kent, do you wish to propose and then speak to your motion as printed on pages 63 to 64 of the agenda.
Mr. Mayor, this is another motion, this another instance where this would have been very relevant back in November, is not quite so relevant now, so I will withdraw the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Kent. Well, thank you all. That concludes the business of the meeting this evening. And just before I declare the meeting closed, I hope that you're all bearing out well under the current circumstances, and I'm sure you're supporting your residents locally as best you can under these troubling times. So thanks very much for all you do. The meeting is now closed.